Welcome back. Today, we are talking about a man whose name almost nobody knows. But the organization he commanded is one of the most infamous military units in the entire history of the Second World War. He commanded Hitler's personal bodyguard division, the most elite, the most decorated, and one of the most brutal SS divisions that ever existed. He led them through some of the bloodiest battles of the war. He watched his men commit atrocities across Europe, and then an artillery shell took his leg and removed him from the war forever. His name was Theodor Wisch, and his story is the story of what happens when absolute loyalty to a murderous regime is dressed up in the language of military honor. Theodor Wisch was born on December the 13th, 1907, in a small village called Wesselburner Kug in the Schleswig-Holstein region of northern Germany. He grew up in a quiet, rural community close to the North Sea coast. His family was modest and hard-working. There was nothing in that flat, windswept landscape that suggested the boy growing up there would one day command one of the most feared military divisions in human history. He was athletic, disciplined, and serious from an early age. And like many young Germans of his generation, he was shaped profoundly by the political chaos and national humiliation that followed Germany's defeat in the First World War. He joined the SS in 1931. He was 23 years old. This was the very early period of the movement, years before Hitler came to power, when the SS was still a small personal bodyguard organization with a few hundred members. The men who joined in those early years were true believers. They were not joining a powerful organization with guaranteed career prospects. They were joining a fringe political movement that could easily have come to nothing. Wisch was one of those early true believers. He committed himself completely to the Nazi cause from the very beginning. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Wisch was part of the unit that would become the most prestigious formation in the entire SS. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Translated directly, this means the lifeguard SS Adolf Hitler. It was Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment, named after the Führer himself, and it occupied a special place in the entire Nazi hierarchy. These were supposed to be the perfect soldiers of the perfect ideology, physically imposing, ideologically committed, absolutely loyal. They were Hitler's own men in a way that no other unit in Germany could claim. Wisch rose through the ranks of the Leibstandarte steadily throughout the 1930s. He was a capable officer who impressed his superiors with his tactical ability and his absolute commitment to the organization. He served in the annexation of Austria in 1938. He served in the occupation of Czechoslovakia. And when the war began in earnest in September 1939 with the invasion of Poland, Wisch was there with the Leibstandarte, one of the first SS units to see combat. The invasion of Poland lasted 5 weeks. The Wehrmacht and the SS crushed Polish resistance with overwhelming force. But the invasion was not just a military campaign. It was from the very beginning a campaign of terror against the Polish civilian population. SS units, including elements of the Leibstandarte, participated in atrocities against Polish civilians and Jewish communities in the opening weeks of the war. Villages were burned, civilians were shot, Jewish communities were subjected to violence and humiliation that was just the beginning of what was coming. Wisch was present through all of this as a senior officer in the Leibstandarte. He knew what his organization was doing beyond the battlefield. Then came France in May 1940, the campaign that shocked the entire world. Germany crushed the French army and forced the evacuation of British forces at Dunkirk in just 6 weeks. The Leibstandarte fought through Belgium and France with distinction, demonstrating the kind of aggressive armored tactics that would define SS combat operations throughout the war. Wisch performed well and continued his rise through the unit's officer ranks. But it was in the Soviet Union where the true nature of the Leibstandarte and the war it was fighting became impossible to ignore. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union with 3 million soldiers. The Leibstandarte was part of the Southern Thrust, driving through Ukraine toward the Black Sea. The fighting was unlike anything the division had experienced in Poland or France. The Soviet Union did not collapse in 6 weeks. The Red Army fought back with a ferocity and a willingness to absorb casualties that German commanders had completely failed to anticipate. And in this environment, on the Eastern Front, where the Nazi regime had made clear from the very beginning that this was not a conventional war, but a war of racial extermination, the Leibstandarte and units like it committed atrocities that went far beyond anything that could be justified by military necessity. Prisoners of war were shot rather than processed. Civilians suspected of partisan activity were executed. Jewish communities in the path of the advance were subjected to mass murder by the Einsatzgruppen, operating directly behind the advancing SS and Wehrmacht units. The Leibstandarte operated in this environment. Its officers knew what was happening, and the evidence shows that unit members participated directly in some of these killings. One of the most documented atrocities associated with the Leibstandarte on the Eastern Front occurred in the early months of the campaign. In the town of Taganrog in southern Russia in October 1941, members of the Leibstandarte were involved in the execution of prisoners and civilians. These were not isolated incidents committed by individual soldiers acting without orders. They were part of a systematic pattern of behavior that characterized SS operations on the Eastern Front from the very beginning, and that was known to, and in many cases ordered by senior officers, including those in Wisch's chain of command. Wisch himself was by this point one of the most senior regimental commanders in the Leibstandarte. He was not a distant figure removed from the realities of what his division was doing. He was present. He was commanding men who were participating in this war of extermination. And like virtually every senior SS officer on the Eastern Front, he did nothing to stop it and everything to continue it. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was catastrophic for Germany. The advance had stalled. The Red Army launched massive counteroffensives. German forces suffered casualties and privations that nobody had planned for. The Leibstandarte was pulled back to France to rest and refit, and when it returned to the Eastern Front in 1942, it returned as a fully mechanized Panzer Grenadier division with massively increased firepower and armored strength. In early 1943 came one of the most significant battles in the division's history and one of the most significant moments in Wisch's career. After the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad, where an entire German army was encircled and destroyed, the situation on the southern part of the Eastern Front was desperate. Soviet forces had broken through and were threatening to collapse the entire German position in Ukraine. The SS Panzer Corps, which included the Leibstandarte, was thrown into a massive counterattack that became known as the Third Battle of Kharkov. Under the command of Paul Hauser, the SS divisions drove back the Soviet advance and recaptured the city of Kharkov. It was one of the most significant German tactical victories of the entire war, and it temporarily stabilized the front. Wisch played a significant role in this operation and was decorated for his leadership. He was awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross, one of the highest military decorations in Nazi Germany. He was now one of the most respected combat commanders in the entire Waffen-SS. And in the summer of 1943, he was given the command that represented the peak of his military career. He was appointed commander of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. He was now in command of Hitler's own division. Almost immediately, he led his division into one of the largest tank battles in history. Operation Citadel, the German offensive at Kursk in July 1943, was Hitler's attempt to eliminate a massive Soviet salient and regain the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The Leibstandarte was part of the southern pincer of the attack. The battle that followed was one of the most intense armored engagements in the history of warfare. Hundreds of tanks on both sides clashed across the steppe. The fighting at Prokhorovka, where SS armored units, including the Leibstandarte, engaged massive Soviet tank forces, has become one of the most studied and debated battles of the entire war. The German offensive ultimately failed. Soviet defenses were too strong and too deep. German losses were severe, and the strategic situation on the Eastern Front shifted permanently in favor of the Soviet Union after Kursk. Germany would never again mount a major strategic offensive in the East. From this point forward, it was fighting a defensive war against an enemy that was growing stronger every month. Wisch led the Leibstandarte through the brutal defensive fighting that followed Kursk. The division was transferred to Italy briefly after the Allied landings, then back to the Eastern Front, then to France in preparation for the expected Allied invasion. By June 1944, the Leibstandarte was in Normandy facing the Allied forces that had landed on D-Day. And here we have to talk about one of the most notorious atrocities committed by the Leibstandarte during the entire war. On June 7, 1944, the day after D-Day, soldiers of the Leibstandarte murdered 89 Canadian prisoners of war at a location called the Abbaye d'Ardenne, near Caen, in Normandy. These were soldiers who had been captured in combat, disarmed, and were entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention. They were shot in the head. Their bodies were found after the fighting moved on. The commander most directly responsible for ordering these murders was Kurt Meyer, one of the senior officers in the division. But the murders happened within the Leibstandarte under Wisch's overall command. This was his division. These were his men, and Canadian prisoners of war were murdered by them in cold blood. Wisch's time in command ended violently on August 20th, 1944, during the desperate fighting around the Falaise Pocket in Normandy, where a large portion of the German forces in France were encircled by Allied forces. An artillery shell struck near Wisch, and he was catastrophically wounded. He lost his leg. He was evacuated from the front and spent the rest of the war recovering from his wounds. He never returned to active command. He survived the war. He was captured by Allied forces and held as a prisoner of war. He was investigated in connection with the murder of the Canadian prisoners at Abbaye d'Ardenne, but was never formally prosecuted. The primary prosecution focused on Kurt Meyer, who was tried by a Canadian military tribunal and sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to life imprisonment and then reduced further. Wisch avoided prosecution entirely. He was released from captivity and returned to West Germany. He lived quietly for decades. He died on January 11th, 2001, in Weselburener Kug, the same small village in northern Germany where he had been born 93 years earlier. He had outlived the Third Reich by 56 years. He had outlived most of his contemporaries. He had outlived any realistic prospect of justice for what his division had done. Here is what we need to remember about Theodor Wisch. He was a gifted military commander. His tactical ability was real. His courage under fire was real. The decorations he received reflected genuine military achievement, but all of that military achievement was in service of one of the most criminal organizations in human history. The Leibstandarte was not just a fighting division. It was an organization that committed mass murder on the Eastern Front, that murdered prisoners of war in Normandy, that participated in the broader machinery of SS terror and genocide throughout the war. Wisch commanded that organization at the height of its power and its criminality. He cannot be separated from what it did. Military skill does not cancel out moral responsibility. Tactical brilliance does not erase the blood of murdered prisoners and civilians. Theodor Wisch was a soldier. He was also the commander of a criminal organization. Both of those things are true at the same time, and both of them need to be remembered. Thank you for watching. If this video was worth your time, please hit the like button. It helps the channel more than you might think. Subscribe if you are not already with us. We cover stories like this every single week. Drop a name in the comments if there is someone you want us to cover next. We read every single one. See you in the next video.